A first-round pick compares Garrett Nussmeier to Jayden Daniels. Is he right? It's Locked on LSU. Here we go.
You are Locked on LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Okay, let's get it. It is Locked on LSU, your team every day. I'm your host, Matt Moscona. Thanks so much for making us your first listen. We're free, available wherever you get podcasts, of course, on YouTube as well. So please subscribe. As always, one of the fastest ways to help us grow is by leaving your comments below. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Ton to do on today's show. Brian Thomas comparing Garrett Nussmeier to Jayden Daniels. We've heard it before. We're going to dig a little deeper today. Our exclusive chat with LSU super booster Gordon McKernan, and looks like Beth Torina will be back at LSU in 2026. We'll tell you why, and we'll react to it coming up on today's episode. So thank you so much for spending part of your day with us and for making us your first listen. Okay, I would love to play this soundbite for you, but I'm not going to because Brian Thomas Jr. was at an event in Baton Rouge this weekend, and Jacques Doucet of WAFB caught up with him. And Brian Thomas made a comp between Jayden Daniels and Garrett Nussmeier. I'm not going to play the audio for you because in the background, they're playing Eye of the Tiger, and I'm afraid that if I play that soundbite, it'll pick up Eye of the Tiger, and this whole thing will get flagged, and so I'm not interested in having that happen. So I'll just read for you the quote whenever the two were sitting there talking. Brian Thomas said, "Seeing Nussmeier get better every year and progress throughout the years, I feel like he can do the same thing." Meaning Garrett Nussmeier can do the same thing that Jayden Daniels did year over year. Now, I want to provide some context here, and that's not nothing. Because remember, Brian Thomas was in the same signing class as Garrett Nussmeier. So yes, Brian Thomas became a first-round draft pick, catching passes from Jayden Daniels in 2022 and 2023, predominantly the 2023 season, which was the big blow-up year where, of course, Malik and Brian Thomas became first-round picks. Jayden Daniels won a Heisman, went on to be the second overall pick. You all know the story. But remember, Brian Thomas signed in the same class as Garrett Nussmeier. So they came in together. And something that happens often for young players, especially quarterbacks and receivers, is they end up running a lot of routes together. What I mean is, I remember this vividly. If you go back to 2011, this can be hard for maybe some people who don't remember that season. If you're maybe a bit younger, but you got to remember the context of the time in 2011. LSU had no passing offense. That was the doldrums of the Les Miles era when they couldn't throw the football, and so they bring in Zach Mettenberger, and Mettenberger comes in 2011 from JUCO and sits behind Jordan Jefferson and Jarrett Lee. In 2012 was supposed to be, hey, unleash Met. As we saw it all played out, really. He was good at the end of 2012, but 2013 was the kaboom. Kind of like Joe Burrow, kind of like Jayden Daniels. But I remember interviewing Jarvis Landry, and Jarvis was a freshman in 2011. And Jarvis played in 2011, some at receiver, a lot of special teams. But by and large, 2011 was Ruben Randall and Russell Shepard. Odell was a freshman in that class as well. And Jarvis had a broken foot, and it cost him a lot of fall camp. So he was just a little delayed in the offense. But I remember talking to Jarvis, and he was so intentional that whenever they were at practice and they're doing quarterback and receiver drills, he would make sure that he would get in line wherever he was in the receiver line to make sure he was catching passes from Mettenberger. Because it wasn't about 2011, and Mettenberger wasn't playing in 2011. It was about the future. And Jarvis knew Mettenberger was going to be the one throwing in passes in 2012 and 2013, and he wanted every rep for every bit of timing. So they developed a great rapport together. Mettenberger and Jarvis did, as we later saw. Jarvis and Odell went on to have that amazing season in 2013 when LSU became the first team ever to have a 3,000-yard passer, 2,000-yard receivers, and a 1,000-yard rusher all in the same offense. And a lot of that, those seeds were sown in 2011 when Jarvis was a freshman catching balls from Mettenberger. All that to say, if you think of it the same way, when Brian Thomas and Garrett Nussmeier came in together, guess who was working together on timing routes and everything? Now, Jayden came in 2022 and he, became the starter, and then Brian Thomas in 22 and then 23 hit the kaboom. But early in his career, Brian Thomas was catching a lot of passes from Garrett Nussmeier with the running scout team and practice and all that stuff. So all that to say, he would know. Now, if you're just looking statistically, Jayden Daniels' first year at LSU in 2022, he threw for 2,913 yards, 2,913. Garrett's first year as a starter, by the way, remember that both of them is their fourth year in school. Garrett's first year as a starter, 4,052 yards. So Garrett Nussmeier threw for 1,100 yards more than Jayden Daniels in his first year as a starter. Jayden threw for 17 touchdowns in his first year as a starter at LSU. Garrett threw for 29. So Garrett Nussmeier, didn't spell it out. Garrett Nussmeier in his first year, his fourth year in school, his first year as a starter at LSU, threw for 1,100 more yards and 12 more touchdowns than did Jayden Daniels. And remember, Jayden in that first season also had the SEC championship game. So 12 regular season games, SEC championship, and a bowl game. So Jayden played in 14 games that first year. Garrett had 13 games, threw for 1,100 more yards and 12 more touchdowns. Different offenses, no doubt. Another big part of it, too, is in that first year, Jayden Daniels ran for 885 yards and 11 touchdowns. So all in, their total offensive numbers were actually really comparable. It's just that all of Garrett's numbers came through the air. Jayden had 2,900 in the air and 885, nearly 900 on the ground. But when you total them up, they're almost identical seasons statistically as far as what they accounted for, total offense and touchdowns. And then Jayden had the big kaboom. He threw for 40 touchdowns, ran for 10 more. He threw for 3,800 yards, ran for 1,100 more. So you're talking about 5,000 yards from scrimmage and 50 touchdowns. Can Garrett Nussmeier be a 5,000-yard, 50-touchdown guy? I don't know. If LSU makes the playoff and ends up playing 14, 15, 16 games, then certainly that can happen. Like Joe Burrow threw for 5,000 yards, but he also had 15 games that year, 12 regular season games, the SEC championship, and 2 playoff games. So sure, it's possible for Nuss to achieve that with more games. But remember, Jayden Daniels did that all in 12 games because he didn't even play in the bowl game. So he was outstanding that season. But it would take something like that for Garrett to be in that conversation. But I do also think, when you look back, a big part of the reason that Jayden Daniels had the season he did is he was throwing to Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas and Kyron Lacey, and he had first-round draft picks. And when you look at it now, Garrett is going to have Chris Hilton and Aaron Anderson and Nick Anderson and Barry Brown and Trey'Dez Green and Bauer Sharp. And the talent in that offense is going to be such that defenses aren't going to be able to try to key on one guy to stop it. And there's a lot of guys that are going to be able to make plays for Nuss to supplement the way a lot of those guys did, Malik and Brian Thomas, for Jayden in his Heisman season. So Jayden was outstanding. And it's one thing for me to say, yeah, look, we saw it with Joe Burrow. We saw it with Jayden Daniels. We saw it with Zach Mettenberger. Their first year as a starter at LSU, their fourth year in college to their fifth year in college, their second year as a starter. Now we're going to see the same thing from Garrett Nussmeier. It's the same situation. Back at Mettenberger, his first year starting at LSU was his fourth year. Burrow, Jayden Daniels, same thing, and now history repeating itself a bit with Garrett Nussmeier. You would absolutely expect that he would improve year over year. The question is, how much can he improve? From 4,052 yards and 29 touchdowns, how much higher can he go in 2025? That'll be the telltale. Brian Thomas, big believer in Garrett Nussmeier. So too is Gordon McKernan, one of LSU's most prominent boosters. Had a chance to visit with Gordon McKernan about the upcoming revenue share era and where LSU fits in and all of it. We'll get to that next as we continue Locked on LSU, your team every day. The NBA playoffs are in full swing, and every night delivers highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments. Whether it's a game-winning shot or a breakout player, there's never been a better time to get in on the action. FanDuel makes it easy to stay in the game before tip-off and live. With player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays, fans have more ways than ever to play smart and win big. How could a $200 bonus in bets add to the excitement if your first $5 bet hits? You can check it out at FanDuel. If you're new to FanDuel, it's the perfect time to sign up. So head to FanDuel.com, place your first $5 bet. If it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. As we move closer to the start of the rev share era, there's a lot of questions that still need to be answered among the haves and the have-nots, and how that revenue share era is going to look. See, what we've seen up until this point is pay for play under the guise of NIL. But there's no confusing what's actually happening right now. Student athletes are getting paid an exorbitant amount of money to play their sport. And maybe they sign an autograph or take a picture, show up at an event, but it's inequitable with what they are doing for what they are getting. That's going away with the House settlement, presuming it does in fact get signed, as we're all assuming that it will. Remember, every NIL deal over $600 will be subject to a clearinghouse run by Deloitte. So Deloitte will, and this accounting firm, will have to determine if the deliverables actually equal market value for that player. So if you want to, if a booster or a business owner wants to do $1,000, a $10,000, $100,000, $1 million NIL deal with a student athlete, the deliverables have to equal the market value of that NIL deal. So you have to have $1 million worth of deliverables if you want to pay them $1 million. Deloitte is going to choose that. So it's going to be really fascinating to see, because Gordon McKernan has been a guy who's actually done it really well. You might recall back in 2021 when NIL started, LSU was very slow to the game. And it was Gordon who, at the end of the 2021 season, when Alabama was trying to lure Kayshon Boutte into the transfer portal to go to Tuscaloosa, it was Gordon who stepped up and was like, this ain't happening. I've sat on the sideline long enough. And he jumped in and did an NIL deal with Kayshon to make sure that he stayed at LSU. And that opened the door for Gordon McKernan that he probably never thought that it would go this way. He even said in this interview with me that he just thought he was doing a good thing to keep Kayshon in Baton Rouge, see how it went. And to date, he estimates he spent about $5 million on NIL deals for student athletes, both at LSU and other Louisiana schools, revenue sports like football and men's basketball, and non-revenue sports like softball and women's basketball and many others. So it's always great to get the perspective of someone who is in the trenches, who is quite literally at the focal point of all these conversations, because he's one of the premier boosters at LSU who's actually participating greatly in NIL. And so I asked Gordon if revenue share is going to change his approach to NIL.
And I think it's going to be somewhat different, but not completely different. Obviously, those schools that decide to spend up to the $21 million, $20.6 million, whatever it is, are going to be an advantage. Not every school is going to be able to do that, right? And I don't think, if the listeners don't understand, it's a matter of the athletic department taking $20 million out of their budget, right? And they have to get it from somewhere, right? The ticket sales or licensing fees or wherever. And they can appropriate that amongst all the various sports in whatever manner they want. They give it all in football, they give it to basketball, they give it to one player. So there's a lot of freedom for the university to do that. Most of them are doing it based upon kind of the structured terms, where football is going to get about 75%, and you have to go on down the line. Well, what that's doing is those sports that maybe are not as big a revenue generating, or don't generate at all, women's basketball, men's baseball, sports like that, they still need their money. And these other schools with deep, deep pockets are reaching into their pockets above the rev share. So are we going to be left behind, or how do we bridge that gap for those other sports? I think football is going to be well taken care of with that amount of money, right?
You think so? So if
I
you just
do.
assume,
I think to a large degree. I mean, now we're going to supplement, I'm sure, whether Bayou Traditions is still around or not and how it happens. I think there's still going to be supplementation by business owners. I mean, that's what the whole clearinghouse is going to be about. So if we sign a player, it's got to be fair market value. It's got to be approved by whichever accounting firm it's going to be. So there's still going to be some of that. But I think I think a lot of our issues in football will be solved by the rev share.
That's interesting. So rev share, he thinks, largely will solve issues in football. So if you have $15-16 million a year, he noted there might be a Bryce Underwood, an outlier, but generally speaking, that $15-16 million is going to take care of football. You may have to supplement over the top, but the supplementation part is the most interesting part to me. Because if LSU does, in fact, allocate $15-16 million a year in the rev share to the football roster, okay, do we see other schools spend more than that? And if so, you got to keep up with the Joneses. I mean, as we've seen. But what was so interesting was hearing him say things like women's basketball and baseball. Because if you have $21 million and $15-16 million of it goes to football, well, another giant chunk, the next biggest chunk, is going to go to men's basketball naturally. Well, you keep shrinking that pie for all the other sports, and then you have sports like women's basketball and baseball that do spend, well, you don't have enough money. So how do you do it? Well, you supplement. So that's going to be the really interesting part is, will business owners, will boosters continue to find a way to legitimately supplement through NIL? That's why someone like Gordon is so important, because he is actually doing legitimate NIL deals in an era where it's really just glorified pay-for-play masked as NIL. If Gordon wants to spend $1 million a year to do deals with members of the G team and LSU sort of maybe shuffles a few guys his way or ladies his way, I mean, think about it. Kim Mulkey, Gordon even told a story in this interview, and you go listen to the entire interview, by the way. I spent about 30 minutes talking to Gordon. If you're on podcast or YouTube, you can just search AFR LSU, or if you want the full thing, after further review. But Gordon told a story about a women's basketball player from LSU, on this most recent team, who just went into the portal. And this was a role player on the team. He wouldn't mention her by name, and I respect that. But he said it wasn't Flaugier or Michaela Williams. It was a player on this women's basketball team that went into the portal who another school paid her $200,000. This is a role player at LSU. He didn't mention the name, but that's an exorbitant amount of money in a non-revenue sport. Remember, LSU women's basketball lost $8 million this past year. Now, I firmly planted in the belief of it's a loss leader. Like, of course, on the ledger, on the spreadsheet, what you spend and what you make isn't equitable. But you look at what a successful women's basketball program is meant for LSU, the marketing value, the attention that you've been able to get. I mean, the national championship alone, you're still feeling the residual of that from Angel Reese and Caitlin Clark. So you'll gladly lose $8 million on paper for the assumed benefit of all the exposure. It's like spending $8 million to buy brand exposure, and it's an incredible way to do it. But you have to win, and the same thing goes for baseball, because there is an expectation with baseball that LSU baseball is going to win. Well, to win, you've got to be able to spend. If you look at the top spenders in the SEC in baseball, it's Texas, it's Tennessee, it's Arkansas, Texas A&M. Georgia is in that mix as well, and then LSU is somewhere around that 5-6 mark. You would think it because of the product LSU puts out there, which continues to show why Jay Johnson is incredible at what he does. But LSU's not the biggest spender in baseball, but they're continuing to remain competitive and build the roster. LSU's going to have to supplement, as Gordon was saying, rev share to make sure baseball and women's basketball in particular continue to stay relevant. So I asked Gordon point blank if he thinks LSU will continue to remain relevant and competitive with the big boys in this rev share era.
Yeah, I do. I mean, there's been a commitment over the last handful of months by some big donors coming in above. I know Scott Woodward and the administration is committed to funding rev share to 100% of whatever's allowed, right? It should go up, right, through time. So we've got that. Not everybody's going to be able to do that. Now, I asked Scott about this the other day, just saying, how many of the SEC schools will fund to 100%? Football. You think Vanderbilt's going to fund that to 100%? I don't know.
Yeah.
Mississippi State? I don't know. That's a big chunk of money to take out of your budget. And so you start breaking it down like that. Then above that, which schools have the ability for the donors above that to say, okay, we're still give you some money. Obviously, Texas A&M have that. And then from there, how committed are the rest of the schools? And I do think right now, based upon what I'm hearing, there's a strong commitment from the LSU donor base and business base to continue doing it.
For how many sports? And that's going to be the really interesting part of the whole thing. Because if you're committing that money for football, men's basketball, baseball, women's basketball, maybe softball, you don't have enough to continue to spread among track and field, swimming and diving, soccer, tennis, golf. So what happens to those sports? Gymnastics, which of course is so wildly popular at LSU, but it loses 7 figures a year. And you're like, how can that be? They fill the PMAC. That's true. But if you only have 6 gym meets and tickets are dirt cheap and you're not making money on premium seating like suites at baseball or football or things like that, that's how you actually generate the revenue. So it's a sticky situation, how they're going to be able to make this work. And ultimately, I do think long-term what happens is the non-revenue sports end up getting cut. And that's going to have to be something that's rectified with the NCAA because you have to have so many sports to be within NCAA accreditation. So does that mean the NCAA changes its rules for accreditation? Does the NCAA go away altogether? You see, there's so many different layers to this thing. But one of the central figures for LSU has been Gordon McKernan. He's always been very candid with me, and he said there point blank, yes, he thinks LSU is poised and ready to continue to be competitive in the rev share era, whenever that does, in fact, go into effect. What does it mean for sports like softball? Well, who's going to be the coach of the softball team? A disappointing season-ending loss for LSU this past weekend. There's been questions about Beth Torina. I'll tell you what I've heard. We'll get to that to wrap up Locked on LSU, your team every day. When the LSU softball team season ended over the weekend in a regional loss on Saturday to Southeastern, the question started immediately about Beth Torina's future. And I'll tell you very candidly, and I'm always honest, if nothing else, with you, that I hate that because I think the world of Beth Torina. In my time at LSU, she has been one of my favorite coaches and people to cover. And I hope she stays at LSU forever and wins multiple national championships and retires on her own terms. She's the winningest coach in the history of the program. With all of that said, I'm not stupid. I do understand that at LSU there's an expectation of winning, and it is not okay for LSU in any sport to lose in the postseason to in-state schools and lesser leagues. And that's happened now twice in the last 3 years. 2 seasons ago, LSU in a home regional was in the driver's seat, and ULL beat LSU twice to win the regional and eliminate LSU and end their season. And then this year, LSU lost the regional opener against Southeastern, where LSU led 3-0, lost 4-3. They came back, eliminated UConn with a 3-0 win, then had to come back to beat Southeastern twice. And in a seesaw game, LSU got walked off 8-7. So Southeastern of the Southland Conference beat LSU in the Baton Rouge Regional twice to end LSU's season. That's just never going to be okay. So naturally, all the questions started. Listen, Beth Torina has been to the Women's College World Series 4 times. She went in her first year, and then she went 3 times in 2015, 16, 17. And unfortunately, they haven't been back since. So you're talking about an 8-year drought, nearly a decade since LSU's been to Oklahoma City. And I can understand how people are tapping their feet if you're someone who loves that program and wants to see LSU succeed at the highest level. There's a couple of reasons, however, why it appears as though Beth Torina is going to be back. So after that loss on Saturday, I did start making some calls about Beth's future. And it felt over the weekend, Saturday night into Sunday, like it was about 50-50. But some of the things I consistently heard is, look, there's a couple of great freshmen on this team, and LSU does have the #1 recruiting class in the country coming in for the 2026 season. Would you want to upset that by replacing Beth Torina? That was one question. And then on Monday, I know Jacques Doucet of WAFB tweeted that it appears that Beth will be back. I was told the same thing in a candid conversation I had with someone with, let's say, with knowledge of the situation. There doesn't appear to be interest on LSU's part in paying about $1.5 million to buy out Beth Torina and her staff. So if you're not familiar, Beth makes $400,000 a year. She signed a contract extension which runs through 2028. So LSU, by the terms of her contract, if they fired her without cause, would owe her the entire amount of the contract for the duration. So 3 more years on the deal, $400,000 per year. That's $1.2 million. There's also some incentives in the contract, and then you have to consider buying out the staff. It would push it close to about $1.5 million, as I was told on Monday. So I just don't believe there's an appetite for LSU as they're trying to find money for the revenue share era, which is about to go into effect, as they're trying to cut expenses so that way they can allocate properly money for their student athletes in revenue share. It just doesn't seem like there's an appetite to burn $1.5 million to buy out Beth Torina and her staff, especially when you're talking about someone who's been the winningest coach in the history of the program at LSU, someone who has been to the Women's College World Series 4 times. It's been a while, but it's also fair to say she's brought in the talent, a couple of really good young players on this team, and bringing in the #1 recruiting class in the country. What can you do with that? That's the big question. But it does not appear as though LSU is ready to move on from Beth Torina, primarily because of recruiting and because of the financial burden it would cause in this era of college athletics with the revenue share on the horizon. That appears to be the thing that's going to get Beth Torina at least another year in Baton Rouge. Hopefully she can break through. Okay, y'all, that'll do it for us here on today's episode of Locked on LSU. Thanks for making us your first listen. Now for your second listen, check out the Portal Show. Brian Smith has the latest rumors, portal entries, and signings. Be the most informed fan on the rapid changes to the college football landscape. Find The Portal on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Hey, speaking of podcasts, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Rate us, leave a review. If you're on YouTube, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you're notified whenever we post a new video, and let a friend know if they love the Tigers. We got you here every single day for Locked on LSU, your team every day.